2024. We're joined here with Dr. Edward Walker. He likes to be called Ned, so that's what we'll be doing from here on out. It's a pleasure to meet you, Ned. And again, thank you for coming on. We understand that for all of you who don't know Ned, you want to know a little bit about what he's going to talk about and who he is. We'll start with that. So this week's topic is a reasoned faith, science and religion in a Baha'i perspective. A lot of people have different perspectives on the harmony of science and religion, and that's the beauty of it. It's always evolving, our understanding is always growing, and you're going to probably get something today you haven't heard before, and that's what we're hoping to have. So Dr. Ned Walker is a Baha'i and lives in central Michigan. He's in the United States with his wife, Dr. Jesslyn Ingram, and he has served in the faith in various capacities. He's served as a LSA member, also called a local spiritual assembly. And he has been an assistant to the auxiliary board members in his area. And he's also facilitated book study circles, participating in interfaith events and hosting firesides. He has offered a weekend seminar at the Llewellyn Baha'i School. It's a Llewellyn Baha'i Center of Learning, and he's posted 11 articles that you can also find on BahaiTeachings.org. Dr. Walker holds a university distinguished professor position on the faculty of the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Genetics at Michigan State University, where he has worked since 1986. His work involves research, instruction, and service and outreach. And this all encompasses microbial ecology, emerging pathogens and infectious diseases, insect-borne diseases such as malaria, filariasis, viruses, and control of these problems. He has consulted with the National Institute of Health, Fogarty International Center, the CDC, World Health Organization, Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, and other organizations. And he has worked with the United States. He has worked in the United States, in Honduras, in the Philippines, Uganda, Kenya, Malawi, Madagascar, Papua New Guinea. Overall, he's done quite a bit of work around the world, and the Baha'i teaching of the harmony of science and religion in particular, in Dr. Walker's view, represents one of many forward-looking anticipatory pronouncements and innovations stemming from the Baha'i revelation, whose implications are gradually becoming clearer in the succession of the modern age into the new era. With that being said, the topic, we discussed science and religion. It's one of the many deeply insightful, prescriptive, and anticipatory teachings of the Baha'i Faith. It addresses the conflict of the modern age, namely that scientific explanations of reality necessarily supplant religious explanations, the latter based on perceived uninformed and antiquated notions. But despite its appeal, the idea presents challenges to demonstrate. So how do we find a way to develop meaningful conversations which can engage both people of faith and people of science without suffering the problem of cognitive dissonance? One way is through elimination of these prejudices that stop us from speaking with one another. So examination of scientific ideas and then juxtaposing them with Baha'i ways of observing the phenomenon of religion really is a big part of this process. So in this brief presentation, there will be an establishment of the basis for discourse with some attention to Baha'i texts. And in discussion, we wish to examine scientific ideas regarding reasoning and rationale, and how one arrives at an understanding of reality based upon the application of the scientific method. So using these two ideas, we will examine a scientific theory as an example of one such application, and we will explore common ground between science and religion in the process of falsifiability, of tests of predictions, and of establishing cause and effect relationships. Lastly, time permitting, we will examine a specific area of conflict between religion and science, forming a dilemma and how it can be resolved using guidance from the Baha'i writings. So having said everything, the just the precipitate of this, like everything boiled down to one thing. We're going to discover together in discussion how science and religion, though in the world seemingly at odds, isn't really, and how we can come to meaningful conversations together. So, Ned, we really appreciate you being here with us. It's a amazing topic, and again, going through the process together, I think a lot of people will grow from this presentation. We thank you for making it and being here with us.
Thank you so much, John. It's nice to be here with you. Let me just confirm you can hear me okay and you can see everything all right.
Yes, the presentation's on the screen, and I can see your video as well.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Well, hello, everybody. Aloha pa. So nice to be with you. And I was mentioning to Jeremiah and John how much I admire what they're doing with this program and the stridency of the voice coming out of the Clearwater community and the service that's being provided. It's really wonderful. And so I thought I would just offer this opportunity and, in the hope that it stimulates some conversation and ideas and discussions, and then perhaps helps with some ways that people can then have conversations really of two kinds, I think. One with people of faith and one with people of science. And there really is, in a certain sense, a dichotomy there. So the Baha'i teaching about the harmony of science and religion, we can hope and think about offers a bridge between these two communities. So let's look at that. But before we go any further, John and Jeremiah, if we may, could we start with a prayer?
Yes, that's a wonderful idea.
And I prefer if one of our participants says it if they care to.
Can we have a volunteer, please? Someone in the Zoom?
Sure, I'll do that.
Thank you.
O God, O thou who hast cast thy splendor over the luminous realities of men, shedding upon them the resplendent lights of knowledge and guidance, and hast chosen them out of all created things for this supernal grace, and hast caused them to encompass all things, to understand their inmost essence, and to disclose their mysteries, bringing them forth out of darkness into the visible world. He verily showeth his special mercy to whomsoever he will. O Lord, help thou thy loved ones to acquire knowledge in sciences and arts, and to unravel the secrets that are treasured up in the inmost reality of all created beings. Make them to hear the hidden truths that are written and embedded in the heart of all that is. Make them to be the ensigns of guidance amongst all creatures, in piercing rays of the mind, shedding forth their light in this, the first life. Make them to be leaders unto thee, guides into thy path, runners urging men on to thy kingdom. Thou verily art the powerful, the protector, the potent, the defender, the mighty, the most generous. Abdu'l-Baha.
Thank you. I've organized this in a little bit of a lecture style, but let's be sure that we have opportunity at any time for people to make a comment or pose a question as you wish. Try to keep the flow going. Got this meeting we have today divided up into pieces, and we'll move along and go through each piece and see what progress we make, and then have a good discussion at particular breaks set into this presentation. But first of all, let's look at these bullet points and consider science and religion. And this is a very important topic. It is important for a lot of reasons, but perhaps one reason is that from a certain point of view, the traditional and orthodox religious systems seem to be failing humanity's pressing needs and even causing the very problems they purport to address. For example, it's common for people to point at interreligious violence and warfare as the cause of religion. And so religion per se is under challenge from that point of view. So people may be searching for solutions to these same pressing problems through scientific or materialistic means. And we could ask ourselves some questions about this. Well, how well are we doing with these material solutions? Is science writ large really doing that much better? The Baha'i Faith calls for a balance of spirituality and materiality in a complementary fashion, where one reflects the other rather than opposes the other. How does this statement develop further? It's not an automatic complementation. It would take work, and we'd have to think about how it would actually happen. So we can ask ourselves, well, do we agree with this idea? How can they possibly be linked together? And for us, in our present circumstances within the Baha'i community, let's say, perhaps most importantly, we need to engender in ourselves the capacity, the vocabulary, or sort of navigational tools, and perhaps even muster some courage to develop dialogues and engage in discourse where the science and religion topic provides the open door. I find this to be a particularly promising way to have conversations with people. And I think there are ways to do this that I hope we can arrive at as we go through the conversation today. So, do the Baha'is have anything to offer to this topic that brings a new and refreshing perspective? I think so. It's a very large topic. Of course, there are entire courses offered on this topic, summer school courses, weekend workshops, to try to condense this very important and large topic into a very short time period is a challenge. But let's see what we can do with it, and we can always expand later and revisit ideas as we go along. Now, it's really almost an understatement to say that this notion of the harmony of religion and science is an important fundamental teaching of the Baha'i Faith. And here's a quotation from Abdu'l-Baha. I'm just going to read it and we'll follow through. This is from Promulgation of Universal Peace, as you can see, from a talk that Abdu'l-Baha gave in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in May 1912, when he said, "The third principle or teaching of Baha'u'llah is the oneness of religion and science. Any religious belief which is not conformable with scientific proof and investigation is superstition. For true science is reason and reality, and religion is essentially reality and pure reason. Therefore, the two must correspond. Religious teaching which is at variance with science and reason is human invention and imagination unworthy of acceptance. For the antithesis and opposite of knowledge is superstition, born of the ignorance of man. If we say religion is opposed to science, we lack knowledge of either true science or true religion, for both are founded upon the premises and conclusions of reason, and both must bear its test." Now, this is a really important paragraph, and we can see how Abdu'l-Baha is seeing the importance of this topic. Of course, in the Promulgation of Universal Peace, this compilation of the talks he gave during his historic visit to North America, he often listed or illuminated or elucidated the fundamental teachings of his father, of the Baha'i Faith. And he sometimes listed them in different orders or mentioned some and not others. But in this particular talk, he really emphasized it. And if we just go down to the next statement in parentheses here, well, we could ask, well, what was the first principle he mentioned? If this was the third one, what did he mention first? And we'll notice that it's about the independent investigation of truth. And these things are really linked to each other, aren't they? If we're going to investigate truth, we can use some means that we associate with something we think of as science, and that we can arrive at some idea about what is true and really what is not true. And he uses a pretty strong word here, which is superstition. That might even be a word that makes people feel a little uncomfortable. So at the very bottom of the slide, I just think about this. We don't have to discuss this now, but kind of embed this in your mind as we go along. What is superstition anyway? Is superstition testable scientifically? Can we do a scientific test and say that's superstition and that's not? We're going to talk about the idea of falsifiability. If we get along to it, I'll suggest that one way we can look at the phenomenon of superstition is through an appeal to absurdity, which actually Baha'u'llah does in the Book of Certitude. But let's just think about these as we go along. It's a strong statement, it's a clear statement, and it's an emphatic statement from the Master about the oneness of religion and science. Now, when I think about this, and I just think about my own life and who I am, and, just one of many people living on this earth. We have 8 billion, 9 billion people on earth now, along with all the other living things. Big questions come up, and a lot of them can be addressed or are addressed with science, but they're also addressed with a spiritual perspective, a religious perspective. What is life? How did it start? Is life everywhere in the universe? Are we alone, or is there life everywhere? Is there a creative force? Is there a source of life? Was I created? Is there a God? How would I know if there was one? Does my life have meaning and purpose? Are there right and wrong ways of living my life? How would I know which are right and which are wrong? Does it matter? How do I relate to other people or other living things? How do I relate to the world I share with other people and other living things? How do I relate to the universe around me? Does my life end with my physical death? What is consciousness? What is self-awareness? So there are many big questions. I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list. We could think of many more, but these are really fundamental. And of course, people have been asking themselves these questions for a very long time and getting answers from various sources. But there are big questions in life, and science looks at them in a certain way, and religion looks at them in a certain way. Abdu'l-Baha talks about there's one truth, and that science and religion have different ways of approaching one truth. But how do we work to harmonize that? What can we do to see how that matches up? Now, this particular relationship between science and religion, although it's not new, but it is special for the age that we live in, because human culture has changed. Science and the doing of science and the application of science has greatly expanded in human culture. It has very large consequences for some of the big questions we just asked and how we try to get answers for them. And this particular quote from Baha'u'llah, I think, is one of these very anticipatory types of statements that every age has its own problems and every soul its particular aspiration. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age you live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. And I personally, as a Baha'i, I happen to believe that the relationship between science and religion is one of these needs that we need to be concerned with and need to focus on. It's important. Now, there was a man named John Henry Draper. He was British, he moved to North America as a young man with his family after his father died, and he was a chemist. And he founded the New York University School of Medicine. Now, if you read about him, he, as a scientist in the 1800s, he did a variety of different things, but he became, through the course of his life, and by the way, his father was a Methodist minister, a Wesleyan minister. So he had this strongly kind of religious background in his life. But he really became a strong scientific materialist as his life went on. And he spoke at the famous 1860 Oxford evolution debate. This is where Archbishop Wilberforce presented the religious view and other people presented the Darwinian view. And they were really, there were sparks flying. There were very different points of view about how life comes into being and what it's all about. And John Henry Draper is a very good scientist. He was a specialist in photochemistry. He developed basic chemistry of photography very early on. He wasn't the sole originator of it, but he was close. He studied light and how light caused chemical reactions and how that could result in the formation of a photograph. So he did a variety of things, and that was one of them. And the speech he gave at this Oxford evolution debate in 1860 was interesting, and it was entitled "On the Intellectual Development of Europe, Considered with Reference to the Views of Mr. Darwin and Others, that the progression of organisms is determined by law." He meant natural law. That there are laws in nature that exist that allow life to come into being and perpetuate and diversify, and that these laws are unrelated to the creation stories that we read in our sacred scripture. And of course, at this time then, with other evidence, geological evidence, people were starting to question the idea that the earth was only 6,000 years old and that dinosaurs and humans walked the earth at the same time, and so on and so forth. All of this was starting to fall apart. It was becoming viewed as superstition, to use the word that Abdu'l-Baha used. And then Draper also wrote a book. He wrote a book called History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And this is why I just gave us this quote from Baha'u'llah in the slide before this one, because Draper picked up on this. And you'll notice the timing, 1800s, when the Baha'i revelation was emerging. And in this book, he noted that the history of science is not a mere record of isolated discoveries. It is a narrative of the conflict between two contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on the one side, which he's identifying as science, and the compression arising from traditional faith and human interests on the other. So he was picking up on this conflict and not seeing the harmony. So here we are. We've got conflict, and we would like to find if there's some resolution. Now, the Baha'is have looked at this, of course, and there's a large number of Baha'is from a variety of perspectives that have visited this idea and thought about it. One direct response to Draper was this article published in BahaiTeachings.org in 2016 by Maya Bonhoeff, and many of us may know her, wonderful author. And she entitled her work, "The Big Lie, Science and Religion at War." And in this article, Maya dismisses his notion, Draper's notion, and she sort of challenges it. And she, among other things, notes that science and religion existed side by side for a very long time, for centuries and millennia, and across cultures and histories without conflict. And she even says the conflict is a myth of modern times. And she invokes a perspective of a historian of science who's a contemporary, recently passed, Dr. John Numbers, who disclaimed Draper, and Maya Bonhoeff quotes from his work. But nonetheless, the conflict is present in modern society. And believe me, on the 6th floor of the building where I work, it's mighty present. There are people who are adamantly opposed to anything having to do with religion because to them it's superstition, has no explanatory or predictive power, and it's best that it be discarded because it's destructive. So the conflict is present, even if we would like to say that it historically wasn't true. It's present today for sure. Now, there are many Baha'i authors who've looked at this in one way or another. Another article that I like very much is by our friend and colleague and formerly in my community here in Central Michigan, now living in Pittsburgh, Dr. Chris Buck, who I believe has been on this program with you previously, if I recall correctly. And he wrote an article in 2013 called Science and Religion Are Complementary. And this offers a different point of view. Let's just look at a few perspectives that Chris offered. He asked the question, is science a type of religion? And should it replace religion? This sort of leans into what Draper seemed to be saying and what Maya Bonhoeff was rejecting. And his answer is as follows. This is text right out of his article. He said, no. Science, rather than being a type of religion, is a complement of religion, complementary to it. And Dr. Buck had a way of looking at arguments and points of view, and he called this the acronym CLEAR: claim, limits, or boundaries, claim, limits, evidence, assumptions, and rebuttal. So we can see he's actually offering up a form of rational thought, scientific way of looking at the relationship between science and religion, saying that religion and science are complementary. That's a claim. Given that science and religion each has its own domain of authority, they're separated, they have separate limits and boundaries, especially considering the empirical nature of the scientific method, which is evidence, and assuming that science is strictly empirical, dealing primarily, although not exclusively, with observable phenomena, things we can sense, test, measure, see. If the objection is raised that science can theoretically replace religion and effectively perform its functions even better, science would still not constitute a type of religion because the respective functions of religion and science remain distinct. Yet science and religion ideally can and should be conciliant, that is, get along. And there's his rebuttal statement. Now, this is a really interesting point of view. He's separating these two things, but saying that they can be conciliant, that they can be harmonized through their complementary relationship. So let's just dissect this point of view for a little bit. I greatly respect this point of view and the clarity of thinking in it. There's still some problems with the approach. Actually, science and religion both claim to explain natural phenomena. It isn't that science does and religion doesn't, but they offer wildly different explanations. For example, the origin and perpetuation of life. Religion does claim to be empirical. If you study people who advocate a creationism point of view, they're very empirical. They collect rocks and they look at footprints and they do all kinds of things. They just draw different conclusions. Science and religion conflict when considering human nature, meaning, purpose, will, dominion, the ethical dimension of speciesism, the idea that humans are in a hierarchy at the top of evolved life, and also matters pertaining to good and evil, to justice, and to our fate. And then lastly, for science, there's no indication or test of or support for the idea that there are supernatural powers, nor relationships exist demonstrably between supernatural powers and humans. Nor does religion, from a scientific point of view, have predictive or explanatory power. Now, we're going to question this. We're going to go back to these things as we go along. And nature and its laws and processes provide the answers to these important questions. We don't need to resort to religion for these matters. So despite these points of view, we still have conflict. It's there. Now, Dr. Buck goes on to elaborate on this and, well, how might we work towards harmonization? How might we find this complementarity? And he elaborates on writings from Ian Barber and Mikhail Stenmark, and then puts into his own words 4 models for this. One is the irreconcilability model, that science opposes religion and vice versa, that they're not reconcilable. The second is the reconciliation model, that science engages religion and vice versa. This might be the one that we're most attracted to. And he writes about that in this article. The independence model, which they avoid each other. Perhaps this is a little bit of a denial kind of a situation, and perhaps historically that's been the case until Copernicus and Galileo came along and started saying, hey, the earth isn't the center of the universe, etc. Or the replacement model, where science supplants religion and not vice versa. So he gives these different possibilities. And so these are all useful to think about. I'm not going to elaborate on them anymore. Each of us can go back and read this article. We can communicate with Dr. Buck about them if we wish, but they're very stimulating and thought-provoking. Okay, so one of the things that we've just talked about is that, and that Dr. Buck in particular mentioned, is that science operates empirically. Now, what do we mean by that, and how can we find that useful? And I tend to go in the direction of the idea that if we are thinking about something empirical and we are measuring something and accumulating data about a phenomenon, that we have to think about what it is exactly we're doing. And first of all, we're after information. We want to get information about something. And information is a very, very blank kind of category. It's bits of data in an ordered sequence, perhaps, of symbols that can be interpreted as a message. I'm just giving an example of ones and zeros here, which we all know about. Bits. Now, one of the first ways where we can look at complementarity between science and religion is that both use symbolism and both use symbolic reasoning to arrive at conclusions about what this information means. They both do that. And so let's put that on the table as one area of harmony from the get-go. Now, the thing about information is that we actually don't know its meaning. We have to derive meaning from information. I don't know what those ones and zeros mean there. It's quite possible that there's some meaning in that sequence, but I don't know it. If we were to get that from some outer space signal and a big satellite dish would collect it somewhere and would download into a computer, and it were compiled, we would still have to interpret it, and it would be decoding. And we don't know what it means. And there's a wonderful book by a British physicist called Decoding the Universe. It's about quantum physics. Vlatko Vedral is his name, and he talks about the universe as information. And a reviewer of his book criticized him for this because he's, hey, if we're going to have information, somebody's sending the signal and somebody's receiving the signal, and who comes up with the rules by which we understand what that signal means? It's not clear at all how we decode and compile the information. And this brings us to a stopping point. It's a very interesting idea. And in biology, when we think about this, signaling mechanisms, feedback loops, when do enzymes stop acting, what's the control over biological activity? These all have to do with signaling. And there are rules built into biological systems about the meaning of signals. And it requires that the receiver understand what the signal means. And it's not a trivial question. So one of the things that's interesting in our Baha'i faith is this idea that in nature, we see the exposure of God's will. Now, this is a very deep topic. We would have to discuss it, I think, under an entirely different session. But Baha'is have written about it, and the idea that the creative will of God emanates from God and becomes the word of God, which then we understand to be the manifestation of God. And the will of God appears in nature, and nature self-organizes, and life emerges in this process. That is a explanation of the creation is an attractive one. And it could be there that we can begin to sort out this understanding of where rules come from and our understanding of fundamental processes and what controls them. But there has to be meaning. And from meaning, then we derive knowledge. We comprehend the meaning of the information. And we use some mental process to do that. And the thing that our teachings tell us, particularly from Abdul Baha, is that human beings are endowed with this capacity to comprehend, to understand. We can discern. We can use reasoning, reflection. We can use association. We can meditate, and answers come forward to us. We have capacities, imagination, memory. We know these things. And these capacities allow us to know the meaning of information. But then there's an additional layer on top of this, and this is where religion begins to approach science. Well, what wisdom do we derive from what we've come to understand through our capacity of knowing? And I'd like to stop here and just, John or Jeremiah or anybody, what's anybody's understanding of wisdom? Is it worth talking about right now, or should we wait?
Well, I heard have been said that the difference between knowledge and wisdom is, to give an example, that we know the knowledge says that tomato is a fruit, but the wisdom is that you do not put it in fruit salad.
I love it.
Yes. It
Yes.
is true. That is the difference between the two.
Yeah, but the essence of wisdom is the fear of God, the dread of his scourge and punishment, and the apprehension of his justice and decree.
And you are quoting from a text, aren't you?
Yeah, the gleanings, Ned.
Yes.
Am I audible okay all the way down here in Australia?
We can hear you.
Praise be to God.
So thank you for these two perspectives. First of all, humor is a great way to come at an understanding of something. I love it. Humor is always a good pathway for things. So the tomato example is a good one. But then we had a serious example too. Our teachings inform us about wisdom. And wisdom does not come naturally through any scientific means. Wisdom is informed by what surrounds knowledge from an ethical dimension, from a depth of experience, from a source that perhaps is higher than human understanding. One can make that claim, I believe. So there's another way that we can think about complementarity. So let's just move on. Thank you, both of you, for offering that. Okay, so we've talked about information, data, essentially, meaning, knowledge, the implications for wisdom. And of course, wisdom leads us to right action. It should. So what is the nature of scientific activity? What do scientists do, or what do people when they're trying to do scientific things do? Well, I kind of break it down into two areas, generally speaking. One is what we might call systematic investigation. This is clarifying relationships among phenomena, establishing relationships rationally based on common properties and attributes of things. And this leads to models, understanding order, where previously disorder was perceived. Now, I will propose too, and we're going to go along and look at this, time permitting, God willing, that both science and religion develop models. And this is another area of complementarity, and that they can be brought together. And we'll talk about them as we go. In systematic investigation, what was previously unknown becomes known. We don't understand cause and effect necessarily, but we understand relationships. A and B are related somehow, perhaps developmentally, ontologically. Just take an example of the periodic table of the elements, which was generated in the 1800s by Mendeleev. We know that there are things that we can call metals. We know that there are other kinds of elements that are related. There's a logic and order to it. We have to be able to understand the structure of the nucleus of these elements and other facets, properties, attributes of the elements. Do they conduct or not? Do they conduct electricity or not? Etc. And all of these things can be brought together in a way that helps us to understand reality by relationships, and we can systematize our knowledge. Now, a second way is functional investigation. And this is elucidating principles and laws that govern behavior, phenomenon, relationships defined by systematic investigation. And here we elucidate cause and effect. A causes B. For example, the law of attraction of objects in the universe owing to the property of mass due to the force of gravity. So now we have relationships that are causal and not just relationships that are systematic. So generally speaking, we can divide scientific activity into these two. Now, there may be more elements of scientific activity that I'm listed here, but I think this distills them down into two general fundamental categories of activity. So where did this scientific inquiry of either type emerge? And this, we could have whole courses, of course, on the history of science and its development. We can identify the Greek philosophers as a source of scientific inquiry, their use of argument, the development of deduction and induction method, exploring the nature of things, the idea that there's an essence of something, and then there are the attributes that surround that essence. And this is a pretty firm foundation. Very likely the Greek philosophers were influenced by others, but we often go to them as a source. We can also think of the Arabs, the Persians, and the Andalusians, who revived Greek philosophy and resulted in its systematic spread into Europe. And these were the people who developed modern medicine, astronomy, algebra, mathematics, put knowledge into places that we now call libraries where you could access it. They were deeply into inquiry. What is this phenomenon all about? And we've got to be very careful not to neglect ancient cultures. It's hard to know what was going on historically, but Mesopotamia, where agriculture, it's a scientific-based discipline in producing food, emerged. Ancient Egypt, India, China, other places. We can think of the Mayan civilization and their independent development of the concept of zero. So there's a deep history that would take a lot of time to go into. But there is a Western bias in looking at modern history of science, and I'll admit to that, being a Westerner and a North American myself, but we can point to Copernicus and his development of the helio or sun-centric model of the solar system and the universe. This upset the apple cart with religious thinkers, where the earth was sought to be the center of all things and where the creation started. Didn't look that way. And then, of course, the famous stories around Galileo and his use of the observational scientific method and the birth of modern science. Got himself into trouble with religious authorities. Kepler calculated the motions of planets mathematically. He said the laws of nature were the work of God, trying to form that complementarity, that bridge. This continued on with Sir Isaac Newton, who elaborated laws of the universe regarding force and motion, proposed that there's a force called universal gravity. Interestingly, Newton believed in God, and you can read about his belief. It's very elaborate. He was a sincere believer in God, but he was a Unitarian. he used rational thought to reject the idea of the Trinity in Christian theology. Descartes wrote that God set the laws of nature in motion. So this idea that God's will was somehow permeated into the nature around us. But then God left the world alone and remains uninvolved with his creation. God cannot change the laws of nature. Humans have a body and a soul and free will. So Descartes was starting to question this relationship between God and what we call the creation or the contingent realm. And of course, thereafter, we saw the emergence of the Enlightenment period, where scientific and philosophical ideas developed very rapidly. And we began to see that new science emerged, evidence for the triumph of human reason over superstition and religion. A lot of philosophical thought, a lot of scientific activity. And of course, at the same time, the Industrial Revolution arose, which is the application of these ideas for the production of materials, material science, etc. Exploitation of resources. And then this was followed by social and political revolutions. I think we cannot leave out from scientific inquiry the arisal of Marxism, for example, or other theories about the organization of human societies on the basis of political and social relationships. And from there, we saw the rise of materialism and positivism. Positivism being a philosophical school that leans heavily on sensory experience. And of course, through all of this, we saw an increase in elucidation of scientific principles and phenomena. There was an explosion of scientific knowledge, discoveries, as we well know, in the 1800s and 1900s, no doubt about it. Okay, so we've talked about that a little bit, and let's talk about claims to knowledge and who claims to provide knowledge and how can we find sources of knowledge. And this weaves into this history of science discussion that we just had, because these the sources of knowledge and our reliance on these sources has changed over time. The first one perhaps is based on authority. These are convictions, beliefs. They proceed from tradition and culture, perhaps from government-imposed convictions, perhaps from fear, often without independent judgment or assessment. We've always done things this way. This is what we believe on the basis of what we are taught and told to believe. And of course, this is quite limiting, and it would be inconsistent with Baha'i belief. We have authority, but we also have encouragement for independent investigation of truth and the use of our reason. And we have clear statements about this as an important capacity in human life. Another knowledge claim is based on reasoning. Then a general statement or observation about reality is supported by rational analysis and argument, consideration of premises leading to conclusions of conviction. We can invoke certain kinds of reasoning, such as induction and deduction, a third kind of reasoning called abduction. We can base our understanding and knowledge of things on our sensory experience. Conviction starting from what we sense. And this is not just our physical senses, but what we can measure. We can develop tools that measure things. For example, we can develop a tool that sees ultraviolet light or detects radio waves. So there are models that develop out of the sensory experience that purport to explain nature. And then we have mental processes, convictions that arise from our intuition, reflection. Meditation is a powerful tool for developing knowledge and understanding. We have a phenomenon that we all participate in that we call prayer, heavily emphasized in our belief system. We have free association, we have mysticism, we have altered states of consciousness that people seek sometimes. So there are different types of sources of knowledge, and the each sort of lays a claim to the validity of their knowledge on the basis of where it comes from and why it's justified. Now, we have statements about this from our writings. Sorry, just my dog sees something. Abdu'l-Baha says that know that there are two kinds of knowledge: the knowledge of the essence of a thing and the knowledge of its qualities. The essence of a thing is known through its qualities, otherwise it is unknown and hidden. And he goes on to say that as our knowledge of things, even of created and limited things, is a knowledge of their qualities and not of their essence, how is it possible to comprehend in its essence the divine reality, which is unlimited? So Abdu'l-Baha is giving us guidance about how we know things and what our limits to knowing things are. Human beings have this tremendous capacity to know, but we have limits in what we know, no matter what the source is. She'll calm down in a moment. So let's just lead to a little bit of what we understand in terms of science and how science proceeds in this formal instance. Talk about this a little bit. The ideas about classic hypothetical deduction in science emerged. It goes back to the Greeks, but it emerged and became formalized really from the 1600s to present. And there are some key people involved in this that we'll refer to. And the idea is as follows: that scientific discovery proceeds by an initial process of induction. We develop supportive evidence for an idea, and we document that from observations using our senses. And we go from these specific observations to a general sense of what is happening, but we can't prove from this observational approach to a generalization that the idea is true, because we may always find evidence to the contrary. So there are limits on what we can understand from this point of view. And then we move on to confirmation of a scientific idea. And this proceeds by a process that has come to be called hypothetical deduction. We develop observation and support for an idea, and from this idea, we develop a theory. And this theory becomes a mental model, a form of explanation derived by this inductive process of observation and generalization. And then from there, we use our capacity to discern to develop what we call predictions or deductions. And these are hypotheses, null hypotheses that we can make that are testable statements. And the test of the hypothesis proceeds through a formal process that we call disproof. And this occurs by the process of falsification. And we'll talk about what we mean by that in a moment. Now, science doesn't prove. The philosophy of science, as we currently understand it, is that it doesn't prove, rather it disproves. And it brings our understanding of our model closer and closer to what is likely to be true and real. But we never actually arrive at essence, as Abdu'l-Baha just said. We get closer and closer to what we think is the truth, but we always have some reservation, and there's always the possibility that we are wrong. So science proceeds by a process of falsification. Science doesn't prove the truth, it disproves what is not true. And that builds up evidence for what is likely to be true. Now, this is a really important philosophical distinction. And here we see another place where there's complementarity between science and religion. And we can all ask ourselves this: do we not also grow spiritually through falsification? We experience tests and difficulties in our lives. And through that experience, we understand what is not right, what is incorrect, what is untrue in terms of our reality as we understand it. And then we aim to use this amazing process of detachment to remove that falseness from us. And by that way, we grow. We grow to something that we understand to be a truer self. Our self-knowledge grows. Now, I may be describing our spiritual growth inadequately for the audience here, but there is complementarity here between falsification as a process of understanding truth in science and falsification as a process of understanding truth in our spiritual sense. So I see another complementarity range there, as we've just discussed. I'd be very, very interested to hear if others feel that that might be a point of complementarity between the science and religion as we go along. At least give it some thought. Now, Karl Popper developed this and formalized this idea. I'm going to move this ahead. This idea of falsification emerged from this hypothetical deduction process. Formally, he was a 20th century philosopher of science, and this has come to be called the Popperian method. There are people that have difficulty with it, but it's one of the things that has become kind of embedded in scientific thought. And just to review his ideas, proof is onerous. By that, we mean it's very, very hard to establish absolute proof of anything. But disproof only requires that we demonstrate contradiction, that we disprove something through falsification. And this has come to be called deductive logical argument. In the Latin, we say modus tollendo tollens, or the way that denies by denying. And this is the way that we test hypotheses through this falsification process. Now, there is a problem that has emerged in scientific philosophy, which has to do with something called strong inference. And this is just, well, how do you know that you've actually examined the full range of possible explanations? You may have this hypothesis and that hypothesis, but there may be others that you've left out for one reason or another. Maybe you don't know enough, or you haven't measured the right things. There could be a wide range of reasons. So the philosophy of science in reaction to Popper's ideas have related to this notion of, well, how strongly can you infer a conclusion on the basis of falsification when you don't really know what is the full range of hypotheses under consideration? It's an interesting idea philosophically. So I have just suggested to us that there is a complementarity between science and religion because science appears to be an exercise in detachment. Science arrives at truth systematically by removing what is not true. And in doing so, the truth gradually becomes clearer and clearer. And I believe we can ask ourselves, is this not also true in our spiritual lives? As we have seen, we acquire knowledge of the truth by understanding attributes, not knowing essence. So we need to sort out what's the real from the false, which attributes don't apply. And we get closer to that essence, but we actually never know what it is. We approach truth, but never fully arrive at the essence of truth. And one of the explanations for that is knowledge is infinite anyway. The more questions we ask, the more questions arise, which is a paradox of science. You would think we'd have fewer questions as we resolve scientific problems with this approach. But in fact, we find that there's an expansion. We have more questions than we had before we started asking them. So this is one of the great paradoxes of science, is that we never arrive at the truth. We find out there's a lot more behind these doors. And of course, I'm reminded by this wonderful statement from Baha'u'llah, let it now be seen what your endeavors in the path of detachment will reveal. This is one of my favorite quotes from him. It's a statement of mystery, and I think it's very profound, but here we can see how it applies in both of these realms, science and religion. I'll be interested to hear your opinions about this. Now, there are alternatives to classic hypothetical deduction. We can go through them. We don't have to use this method. In fact, it's pretty restrictive. There's some people that do science who say, well, if you can't use the hypothetical deductive method, well, you're not really doing science. You're doing something else. So there's arguments within the scientific community about rigor and about how we actually know things on the basis of the way that we approach. I'm not in that category at all. There are other ways to know that we can call scientific. So I don't think we need to make these arguments, but there are people who do it. Yeah, and that's where the conflict between science and religion may return. Because, but we're going to look at some places where we might do some tests of some of our teachings and see if they have validity. Okay, so we have this classical approach, but we also have this idea that we can develop models in our mind. We make observations, we develop a theory or idea about what these observations mean that may be something close to reality. And instead of doing hypothesis testing, we develop in our minds several candidate models, and we look at each one and we make more observations. We choose the best model, we make more observations, and we just develop a base of support for the model, which is separate from the formal process of hypothesis testing. And more, this candidate model approach is receiving support from the scientific community. Now, here too, I find complementarity with religious belief. We have models about the impact, let's say, of religious teaching on human society. I'm going to talk about one of those models in a little bit that proceeds from our teachings, and we'll see if we can actually think of it in this light as a way of doing model formation and tests and development. I actually think that the Institute process in place is exactly that. Provides us with a model about the transformation of society, aligning it with spiritual principles that increases the unity and security of humanity on the basis of change. So let's take a simple example of a model and let's just see if this works. What do we mean by this word model? It may not be very clear to us. And I'm being mindful of the time, Jeremiah and John, and we could, I do have a stopping point coming up, but if we keep going and if people are patient, then we'll keep going. If people need to stop, then we can just say so. Perhaps there will be time later to continue this at some later sessions, if you wish. I live in East Lansing, Michigan, close to there. A lot of restaurants around here. There's a big university in this city. And students at the university go to these local restaurants. Now, let's make some observations. Let's collect data. We could go to restaurants and we could count the number of students in those restaurants. We could physically count them and we could collect data. And then we could ask a question. Now we're starting to develop a hypothesis based on our model that students go to restaurants, and there may be some factors determining why students like to go to this restaurant and not to that restaurant. Why is there variation in abundance of students in these different restaurants? If you owned a restaurant, you might want to know this too. So what factors influence or affect the abundance of students at local restaurants around here? Well, let's develop some hypotheses. Let's say the abundance of students at any given restaurant is determined by the cost of food in those restaurants. Students are looking for a good deal. If the food is too costly, they may not go there. The abundance of students at restaurants is determined by distance from the campus where they go to school. The abundance of students is determined by the type of refreshment offered. For example, does the restaurant serve alcohol? Does it serve coffee, etc.? We could have a null hypothesis, and this is one that we reference to all the others. The abundance of students at restaurants is random with respect to any of these factors. There is no explanation. There's no cause and effect. That will be our reference point. Now, what would we do if we develop this multiple models approach that I just mentioned? Well, it resembles something that statisticians call regression. We could say abundance is related to price. Price is a cause, abundance is an outcome or effect. Abundance equals distance from campus. Might be both. Abundance equals price plus distance. Or it might be a lot of things. Abundance equals price plus distance plus refreshment plus the kind of staff they have there, plus maybe free wireless, plus they're playing good music, plus the location, plus it's near a bus stop, plus it has a chic decor, plus there's some advertising gimmicks. So we could see these models, we could develop a wide range of models, and we can actually test those. And then we might want to come up with, well, what is the best model with the fewest variables that accounts for this variation in student abundance? We call that parsimony, the simplest explanation with the fewest variables. And scientists will seek parsimony. Parsimony reduces complexity. We live in a complex world, but we would like to have the simplest explanations. Now we have a problem too, and this relates to something that we call premise. And when you consider premises, this is something that you consider related to what we call critical thinking. What if the restaurant does an active great takeout business? What if there's a lot of Grubhub activity? We might walk into a restaurant and we see mostly empty seats. Well, we would score that as low abundance, and that would affect our data collection. We have to be careful what we're measuring. That's a premise problem. The premise being that abundance accurately reflects the economic activity of the restaurants. Well, if there's a hefty takeout business, takeaway business, then our critical thinking would have to assess the validity of our premises regarding abundance. We may have to also quantify takeout activity and modify our model. So there's a way that we take observations, we modify our thinking, we look at our premises, and we adjust our thinking, and we get closer and closer to what we think is some model of reality, what explains this variation in abundance. Could be useful for a restaurant owner or a marketer, etc. Now, a lot of people have looked at these kind of approaches. I really admire Austin Bradford Hill. He was a British epidemiologist. He was the person who associated smoking tobacco with lung cancer. And he did this mostly through what he called a set of criteria, establishing strong associations. Here are his list of criteria here, and none of them really involved hypothesis testing. If you can do an experiment, which is the second to the bottom bullet point, well, that would be fine. Perhaps you could do an experiment with mice or laboratory rats or something. Otherwise, you'd have to approach the human population and look for strength and consistency and specificity, temporality. Is there a dose-response relationship? How plausible is the idea? Is there any conflict with something that's known? Are there analogies with similar processes elsewhere? And I would like to suggest to you that this is sound scientific thinking. It does not depend upon the hypothetical, deductive, very restrictive point of thinking, although that could be incorporated. And Bradford Hill, too, has been criticized because he drew strong conclusions on the basis of this wide range of criteria. I would urge you to study this. It's fascinating man, fascinating life. And of course, we come to the agreement that smoking is related to lung cancer and to other health issues, emphysema and so on. But they were not easy to establish. Some people who are not smokers still got lung cancer. Many smokers never get lung cancer. So there's variation. Austin Bradford Hill and his criteria. And then we can work from there to cause and effect. Okay, now we've just had a pretty lengthy review of the scientific method, and I'd like to get to this point, and if there's a stopping point after this, and that could be logically, John and Jeremiah, a place where we could stop today. I'll let you make the judgment, but I hope that we can just talk about these next things and have a bit of discussion and chat. I believe that our teachings provide models for reality, and they are testable. We may not be able to use the formal methods of hypothetical deduction, but we may be able to use criteria that are sound and scientific, such as those that we've just seen. And we can use models and develop alternative models, and we can make observations, and we can build up support for our model, which is our understanding of reality. And this is scientific. And that is where science and religion again become complementary. So let me try to offer this, and let me bring some support to this idea. Now, in bringing this support to bringing this idea out to you, to us in the Baha'i community, I first really have to ask you very sincerely if the Baha'i friends have an appetite for this idea. If you feel like this is something that you're comfortable with when we are considering something that is very sacred to us. Are we reducing what is sacred to something that is not so sacred anymore by suggesting that there's a scientific basis for this? I hope that you don't feel this way, but there may be people who actually do. And so,
Ned, if I may ask, wouldn't
yes,
the concept of understanding reality be our very sacred objective that we're tasked with?
I believe that's true.
So by virtue of this idea of a Baha'i, that the purpose of life is to know God and to attain God's presence, to love God. This idea of discovering the nature of the universe, the wonders of God's creation, and continually coming into the presence of God in each new discovery we find, there's a sacred nature to that that fundamentally would undermine the idea that it's no longer sacred, right?
I agree with you. And if we look at many cultures around the world, for example, the indigenous people of the Americas, we will find that kind of expression. In our Western thought, I feel like we've lost it to a certain extent. Maybe that's a different discussion, but thank you for bringing that up. So good. But I wanted to throw that out there, John, just in case we needed to talk about it.
Well, I'll just make one comment based off of what you were supposing, Ned, and that is this concept, like something that can be seen in the microcosm is how one handles religious texts physically, how one handles a prayer book, how one handles other religious texts, and how that can affect interpersonal relationships with others. Because I've throughout the years, I've noticed how, I would never put a prayer book in my back pocket only because it would offend. So it has that ability to offend others. And I think that's what you were getting at with that context of I guess, making some aspects of religion less sacred from that standpoint. But I understand what John was speaking about, because to me, what John's speaking about is really the macro exercise of the practice of faith.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to look at the big picture and the little picture. Yeah, in and out. That's a good
Yeah.
point.
So
It's
I think
true.
it's
I bet
a
you
good
wouldn't
time to-
you wouldn't put a prayer book on the floor, or I would pick it up. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So, yeah.
I
Yeah,
think it's a good time
100%.
to actually get into the questions. And so now for anyone in the Zoom, if you have any questions about any aspect of the presentation, it would be great if you would either raise your hand just so we can get an order. But if we don't have a lot of people asking questions, then I suppose we could go ahead and close out early. And then if there is there, how many more slides are there to this presentation, just out of curiosity?
I would like to do 3 more, including this one, if you would allow me.
Yes, please. We'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. So we've just been talking about models, and I have proposed that our teachings and the way that we've been given the structure of our faith and the way it's evolved through its allows the development of mental models that can be brought into practice and that can just not just describe reality, but that have application. Now, here's one. This is a proposed model for unity and well-being and human security that it emerges from the Baha'i teachings. All of us will be familiar with this statement from Baha'u'llah. The well-being of mankind, its peace and security, are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. This unity can never be achieved so long as the counsels, which the pen of the Most High hath revealed, are suffered to pass unheeded. Now let's just consider this as a model for a second. Consider well-being and unity. Well-being equals unity. We've just talked about abundance of students in restaurants. So we've said abundance of students equals cost of food, where the cost of the food affects the well-being. Baha'u'llah is telling us that unity will, or lack thereof, affects the well-being of humanity and affects this peace and security of humanity. Does he not? I believe that's what the teaching is telling us. If we are disunified, our well-being, our peace and security are in jeopardy. But as we unify, well-being, peace, and security improve. We can look at this as a model. Now, if we're going to do this, what do we look at in the right-hand side of the equation? What do we understand to be unity? Well, we have teachings. These are the counsels he mentions right in this quote, his teachings. What are these counsels? And we also have such statements from Abdu'l-Baha, such as the 7 candles of unity and other clear statements about what is meant by unity. Drivers of unity, shall we say. Equitable distribution of wealth. Equality of women and men. Universal education. Abandonment of prejudices of all kinds. On and on. We can make a long list. But these are the counsels, and they represent, and they are measures. I would like to emphasize this. They are measures of unity. We can measure unity in these ways, or lack thereof. And then we can relate that to relative well-being. So here's another element of complementarity between science and religion. This model can be tested. In fact, it's under test right now in different ways through our activities, but also independently. Let's look at an example of a test. Let's look at an example. If we could eliminate extremes of poverty and wealth through equitable distribution of wealth, what would happen? Here's a recent paper from Nature, journal called Nature, by these 2 authors, DeCourson and Nettle. The title of the paper, Why Do Inequality and Deprivation Produce High Crime and Low Trust? This is a modeling paper, so they've actually developed models. And if we read a little bit from their abstract, what do they say? Sometimes humans cooperate to mutual advantage, and sometimes we exploit each other. In industrialized societies, the prevalence of exploitation, such as in the form of crime, is related to the distribution of economic resources. And they make an observation, so we're doing science here. More unequal societies tend to have higher crime, as well as lower social trust. So these authors created a model of cooperation and exploitation to explore why this should be. Now, I would like to suggest to you that they are measuring an element of unity. They are actually looking at one of the counsels of Baha'u'llah. Of course, they don't mention the Baha'i Faith at all in this article, but they are actually looking at the problem of the inequitable distribution of wealth and how it affects well-being, how it affects security, and even human behavior. What are their findings? This is profound. We see 2 different elements to this graph, the top and the bottom, A and B. The top they call the poverty trap. They observe that when there's high inequality, there is high exploitation, people exploit each other, there's low trust among people, there's the development of low cooperation, this low cooperation is lack of unity, and interestingly, resources stay static. Resource availability does not change under these conditions. And the result of all of this is insecurity, lack of well-being, disunity, and high crime. And people's behavior is affected. The blue color is cooperation. There's very little cooperation and it goes away. Exploitation increases. The lone forager increases. People try to get along on the basis of their own actions and don't cooperate with each other. And then they identify something they call the virtuous cycle. They observe high equality. Under these conditions, low exploitation of each other. High trust develops. They have a trust index. It's B2, the red dots here. There's evolved cooperation. You can see that the blue part of this graph expands and covers the whole thing over time as they run their model. And interestingly, this is a fascinating outcome. The resources available to everyone increases over time. The result is unity, more cooperation. The result is security. The result is well-being. The result with the increase in resources is mutual prosperity. So friends, I think we can end it here, John and Jeremiah. This is a demonstration to me of a scientific test of a Baha'i teaching. There are many more. We could go on. I have lots more, by the way. I just wanted to give a good one here to kind of end this and then to suggest to us that perhaps one of the highest degrees of complementarity between science and religion is the development of models that are testable, that relate to spiritual concepts that we promote, like unity. And unity relates to well-being. Okay. Can I even stop sharing now, John and Jeremiah, and we'll just have discussion, or what would you like?
If you could leave this slide up just for a minute, because it's actually very interesting, because I've always been under the impression that I think one of the big points people miss about capitalism is it's not so much about garnering more resources. It's about just making more resources more prevalent and more available at less cost to social systems and to the economic systems. And this resource down here in the green is very indicative of what can happen when we have a system. So, you know, when you have a functioning system, it looks like it, at least to me, it supposes that we'll actually be able to support more individuals in the long run.
Yes, that's the implication, is that there's prosperity generated out of this. And by the way, this is not the trickle-down phenomenon that we hear about from some politicians. I looked into that. This is a different process. Trickle-down actually relates to more unequal distribution of wealth. This is something else. This is the development of cooperative networks in human action. And the consequence of that is increased trust and increased resource acquisition, availability across the board. So we see a very positive outcome here. I guess one thing I'd like to ask is, are people comfortable with the idea that a Baha'i concept has actually even been tested here? Is there a scientific test of a Baha'i council, as Baha'u'llah calls them, under consideration this way? Not through any conscious effort on the part of these authors, but this is clearly a highly anticipatory teaching of Baha'u'llah, that unequal distribution of wealth is a problem for humanity, and it can be addressed, and when it is, we can see positive outcomes. So this builds support for our Baha'i model of reality.
Thank you for the clarity. There's a lot to be definitely gleaned from this, and just the concept that we are able to, in a methodological, in a commonly understood manner, arrive at commonly understood conclusions that can be reproduced time and time again, where you isolate certain variables to establish that a phenomena does occur when you do certain things in a certain way. That's a pretty big idea. It's about almost 12:30 here, and time for us to start wrapping up to close out for today. We wanted to thank you, Ned, for coming and bringing this presentation before us. And I think this is a good step to say we would like a second part to this presentation. perhaps?
Well, that would be fine. It depends on how, what your program is and how you got your schedule organized, but there's more to come. And as we all know, this topic, like many of the topics that we address, they could become, turn into a whole course or a workshop, or, you know what I mean? It's not a small thing.
No, it isn't.
None of
But
our
it
teachings are, none of our,
but it
so,
definitely gets
yeah.
the appetite for more started, where you're trying to figure out, is it really possible to establish that spiritual concepts and scientific concepts are complementary sides of the same coin, so to speak. And as we've established here, there is definitely that view that can be established among more than just the one person who has a subjective point of view, that objectively together we can move in a common direction where we commonly understand the same things.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
That's
thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be with you. And be great if we were all together in the same room. In a way we are, but I don't know. I like being
well,
with people. Yeah.
the wonders of technology, there's speaking of science and religion, there's a promise by Baha'u'llah that the means by which we can come together, the scientific means, will be established for this fulfillment of the promise of world unity and world peace. So one of the means has been communication, the lack thereof. The I'm gonna I don't know if someone else has termed this, but I'm gonna say the Romeo and Juliet problem, where if only one had spoken to the other, they wouldn't have both committed suicide in the end, nor would the families have hated each other. So communication is key, and even people who uh, may not like each other, when they actually speak with one another, they'll find there's so much more in common. So what better way than Zoom to even make us closer, bringing everyone into our bedrooms, into our living rooms, wherever we're seeing each other today. It's a beautiful, beautiful place to be commonly with one another on Zoom. We thank you again for coming with us. One last thing for all of you. If you've enjoyed this video and you want to see more, please like this video and subscribe to the channel to watch more. Again, we're planning on having Ned to join us, and we are very grateful for him coming. And we will be shortly sharing with you the part 2 that comes around when we get to posting it. That being said, check out the Facebook page for the Baha'i Center of Clearwater, and also please check out the YouTube channel if you haven't already, Clearwater Baha'is. With that being said, again, thank you everyone. Thank you all. We hope you have a beautiful afternoon. Thank you again, Ned. Thank you all.